Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. In the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, the infamous AI, HAL 9000, tells us it became operational in January 1992. JavaScript didn't become operational until 1995. The HTTP 1.1 standard didn't become operational until 1997. DARPA ran its Cyber Grand Challenge final event at Black Hat in 2016. And today, 54 years after the movie came out and 21 years from when it was set, companies are still trying to put AI into AppSec and developers are still trying to deal with monoliths. Which means this week we talk with Himanshu Dwivedi from Data Theorem about API security and the dusty corners that collect shadow APIs with far too trivial flaws that need to be found and fixed. In the news, leaky origins and indexed DB. Integer underflow gets overwhelming. More ASLR, please. URL authorities and allow lists. Successful security programs, 25 years of HTTP 1.1, and more. Open the pod bay doors and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly. For security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. We're proud to announce Cso Stories, a new podcast series in partnership with Cybersecurity Collaborative and Cybereason. Cso Stories features the candid perspectives and experiences of frontline senior security executives and dives deep into timely security topics. Cso Stories is hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, VP of Cybersecurity Strategy at Cybersecurity Collaborative, and Sam Curry, Chief Product and Security Officer at Cybereason. Listen weekly as they speak with extraordinary CISOs by visiting securityweekly.com/CSP.
This is episode 181, recorded January 24th, 2022. I'm your host, Mike Shima. John Kinsella is out sick this week, got a little bit of the COVID, so we hope he's listening and doing well and will recover quickly. But in the meantime, I'm here with Adrian Sanabria. Hello, Adrian. Glad to have you here.
Hey, Mike. Happy to be here. Happy to step in, always.
Always. And Adrian and I and Paul and Tyler as well did a AppSec Building Labs webcast that we'll mention maybe a little bit later. We'll squeeze that into the news webcast. I got some more questions on that for you, Adrian. But I also have some announcements I got to get through. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit those suggestions by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We'll re-review suggestions monthly and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. Then you can join us February 16th to learn about validation techniques within applications, and March 2nd to learn 5 things you can do to catch more bad guys. To register for these webcasts, visit securityweekly.com/webcasts. And don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts, which will feature that recent labs one that I was talking about, and our technical trainings as well at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Himanshu Dwivedi is the CEO of Data Theorem, an application security company focusing on API security plus mobile, cloud, and web apps. He's been an avid startup entrepreneur since 1999, where he and 3 friends started the West Coast office of At Stake. In 2004, he co-founded ISEC Partners. He also has several publications, including 6 different books and 1 patent. He has presented at numerous conferences, including 6 times at Black Hat. Himanshu received a BS from the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota, and I love this, where he was awarded the Tomato Can Loving Cup Award, which is given to the school's top graduating student. Hello, Himanshu. Thank you for joining us.
No problem. Thank you for having me, Mike.
So we have no good swag that can compete with tomato cans for our guests, but you've just raised the bar. So we're going to have to do something good for you.
Yeah, and it's actually the one of the original tomato cans in this little I guess award that you get. So it is as interesting as it sounds, for what it's worth.
So I'm going to use perhaps that'll be our metaphorical can of worms, maybe not quite tomatoes, but our can of worms here is not quite APIs themselves, but maybe shadow APIs, as I think you've quite correctly called them. And so give us a little bit of sense of what these shadow APIs are and why we should be worried about, them lurking about our networks.
Yeah, definitely. It's actually something that my coworker Doug Dooley talked about 4 or 5 years ago. Is that so? We're obviously a very cloud-centric, app-centric company, and we saw this migration on the cloud to serverless functions like Lambda, GCP, Azure functions. It actually, in our own company, we're a software company too. It took off crazy. Developers loved it. Our finance team loved it too. Developers loved it. Cost went down. And guess what? It spread in our company like wildfire. And so we started noticing that, okay, when we go to AppSec teams out there, we're lucky to work with many of them. We started asking like, okay, we thankfully are your API security partner. Have you thought about how that affects to you in the cloud? And they were like, cloud, of course, this is 5 years ago. Cloud's a layer 3 thing. It's an infrastructure thing. It's VMs and containers. We're fine. And we're like, no. It's actually people, and Amazon wants this, and Microsoft and Google the same. People are writing apps on top of the cloud, and developers are loving that. But do you have an inventory of all these functions that literally can be ran and on prod within seconds? And they're like, hey, Himanshu, we're not using serverless. It's fine. It's kind of like a marketing gimmick by the cloud providers. We're okay. And what do you know? 5 years later, shadow APIs. There is data spilling all over the internet with unsophisticated attacks because the lack of inventory of just not even on-prem APIs, SOAP, REST, even maybe GraphQL, but a lot of it's cloud-based where it's hard to really understand where your inventory is as it pertains to the cloud because developers have so much control, and hence the word shadow APIs. Do you really have an inventory of your laptops? Yes. Do you have an inventory of your layer 3? Yes. Himanshu, we have a partial class B. We have a full class C. Do you have an inventory of your APIs? Wait, what was that again? What? Yeah. And so that's where we are here in 2022 is an API inventory problem. Does not sound sexy, but it is causing a lot of data breaches out there.
Yeah, and it doesn't sound unfamiliar either. You made a really interesting point there that cloud 5 to 10 years ago was really about infrastructure, just moving these containers, instances to run them from the cloud, and that was the level of abstraction. But now we've got that functions as a service, Lambdas. That's our layer 7 abstraction now of the cloud. But as I was introducing you go back to the 90s, at stake, doing a lot of interesting pen testing against APIs, I imagine. Have the APIs themselves also changed over time? Because you mentioned there's some dead simple attacks that are still working against these modern APIs, even though they're on they're in a Lambda, they're on whatever the function as a service for any of these cloud service providers.
Yeah, and it's sadly not even the A words, not the attacks. It's just dead simple. So if we go back to the 90s, Mike, you and I were around at that time in security. We're talking about SOAP and WSDL, and then obviously we moved on to that to RESTful APIs, and now actually GraphQL. But what's happening is I can't tell you how many times people say, okay, listen, we get it. Okay, shadow APIs, API security, we get it. Data theorem, do you guys do injection attacks on APIs? And we're like, yes, we do. But this is not XP command shell in 2002. Like injection on APIs is a kind of a non-starter. It's kind of a gimmicky issue because people want to ride that injection wave, right? On APIs, right now, the attacks are not even needed. You just basically find an API. So here's a clever attack by a hacker group that I was following about 4 years ago. What they would do, and I think they hit about 12 to 17 companies. So what they would do is they look at clients out there, mobile and web clients. They would reverse engineer those clients. And let's just take mobile. Let's say I released my mobile app today, and they would reverse engineer the mobile app and look for all the APIs today, right? And they're clever. And then they wouldn't do anything, right? And so you're like, what's the point of this? So the next release, let's say we have a release 2 weeks from now, they do the same thing. They download the mobile client, reverse engineer it, look for APIs, and then they do a diff. And then what they would do is attack only the new APIs, the shadow APIs, because they knew these new APIs were probably invisible to the security team. So why waste all your effort trying to hack something that the security team already knows about? It's too much effort. Real hackers don't have time, and we're all kind of lazy. So what they'll do is attack the new ones only because they probably like the likelihood of a security team knowing about these APIs are small. And so what they do, Mike, is they connect. They just literally connect to open APIs without authentication, without authorization, and bam, they're getting data. And the amount of times, like 17 that I know about, that this hacker group did this, imagine how many more they did this by unsophisticated, no SQL injection attack, no BOLA attack. It was just basically connects on APIs with low authentication or really poor authorization. And so while I would love to say it was really sophisticated, it was just blocking and tackling.
It doesn't have to be sophisticated if it works, as you were rightly pointing out. And I think too, you mentioned the app inventory. That's near the top of the list of things that you should do. That's, I think, admittedly easy to say, harder to do effectively. And numbers 2 and 3 to that are probably what you were just saying now: authentication and then authorization, especially when we're looking at REST or any of these APIs and how you're trying to represent, or how teams are trying to represent that authentication token to it, whether they're JWTs, something like that. And you mentioned GraphQL as well, which can have some surprising, perhaps, authorization problems inside it too. So it sounds like these are, again, very much layer 7 problems, and they're not specific bug problems either. You haven't mentioned really just that, this is the SQL injection, this is the cross-site scripting CSRF. You're just mentioning basics that developers should be doing. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah. And it's really, let's kind of spinning off a CSRF. There is a API-centric issue called SSRF. The famous hacker Paige Thompson pulled off an SSRF attack with outdated metadata service to compromise a financial service for hundreds of millions of records. So there are really sophisticated attacks like SSRF. So don't get me wrong there. But what's funny is it's not funny actually. It's a very hard problem. Meaning like, okay, let's do authentication first on the APIs, right? So we don't want basic auth. So let's get rid of that. Let's do some token-based authentication, right? Shared secrets, something that's more sophisticated. So okay, cool. We got that down. So now, is the API smart enough, meaning architected correctly, that, hey, user account A connecting to data, objects that access or should only have access to user account B, does that authorization model have a correct check? And if so, will it deny a legitimate token that should not have access to a certain object within the API model? That's hard. Even saying it is hard, right? And so that's the problem. That when it comes to authorization, there's something called the BOLA attack, broken object level authorization. It's a big problem with APIs, and that's really if everyone says, "Hey, do you look for SQL injection on APIs?" I'm like, "Yeah, but it's wasting your time." BOLA is really something. It's the more sophisticated attack. So once you get beyond the basics of, okay, you got your inventory, shadow API is no longer the most pressing issue, now goes to less authentication. So that's the good news. So there's bad stuff in authentication, but you can solve that pretty quickly. But authorization is, I think, going to be the 10-year headache, sadly, with the API attack surface.
I like some of the ways you were describing this too, because you definitely, to me, one of the subtexts here is you're describing a move away from the 2-decade-old AppSec industry of we scan for the OWASP top 10, to use some common marketing at the time, which was both misusing marketing as well as misusing what the OWASP top 10 was designed for. But you're saying, don't focus on SQL injection, don't focus on necessarily this specific attack, focus on these fundamentals. So how is it then that application security companies or security tools should also be repositioning themselves to help with these shadow API types of issues, whether it's the asset inventory, authentication, authorization? How can we do testing of these APIs better to find the flaws that you think that these companies should be focusing on?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple ways. Obviously, data theorem, this is a little bit self-serving, so take it a grain of salt. What I tell my coworkers or my, I'm lucky to, have friends like you, Mike, and CSOs out there here in Silicon Valley and New York. And what we all do as an industry, at least I think the good ones, is we look at the market, and the market in our world is the hackers in compliance versus the features that maybe a certain security vendor is trying to push out, or even OWASP. So the point is inventory is a big problem, and then authorization is a big problem. Not because data theorem says it, not because OWASP says it, because hackers are doing it. So again, we all know it's a well-financed attack industry. It wasn't like when we were younger where it was just a bunch of kids being immature and defacing websites. Now everyone's well-financed. So just because layer 3 is shut down, right? NFS is not going to be on the internet anytime soon. And web apps, thankfully, XP Command Shell is not going to work anymore. It shouldn't work anymore. So SQL Injection is kind of dying. It's not like all the hackers are going to be like, okay, we're done. We had a good 20-year run. We're done. They're like moving to the next level. And so when they move to APIs, watching what they're doing to breach data is essentially what we're asking our AppSec counterparts to do. Like, let's figure out what they're doing. And we've done that. And let's attack that. So yes, injection is on the OWASP top 10 for APIs. I'm not saying let's remove it, but I do tell our counterparts, like, that's not going to get you fired. It's not going to get me fired. What's going to get me fired is that, hey, there's an API that we didn't tell you about. That's going to get me fired. And then the second thing that will get me fired, that, hey, we know about it, but we didn't do a good job protecting auth Z and auth N. And that's the next level. So I would tell AppSec teams is, if you can, somewhere in your department, it might be an old person like me, there's someone who was NetSec. And all they did in NetSec is like, what is my attack surface from my IP address range? Use that same philosophy. What's my inventory? And it's not going to be perfect, because unlike a layer 3 where you have, a defined end range, APIs is unlimited. But what's my inventory? And let's go and make sure I know the authentication of every API. I know the authorization model and maybe the encryption aspect. Doesn't mean things are going to be perfect, but visibility is key here. Visibility is key, especially with so early in the API security world, that if you can get around visibility and the testing and then the protection. But before we even get to protection, it's really visibility and making sure things are locked down.
So if I can jump in here with a question, it seems to me that what has kind of replaced injection flaws for APIs, because the reason you would go after an injection flaw is to get all the data, not just the data you're authorized to access. And then you have cases like the Clubhouse issue where they're saying, no, it's a feature, not a bug, that you can pull all the details of all the members, right? So it's, I think what you're talking about, and it's kind of a statement and a question with these authorization issues, makes injection flaws kind of unnecessary if people are kind of lax with the authorization side of things, and you can just hit an API and download the entire database that way.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. And again, everyone has this problem. So my next example, which is exactly like yours, has nothing to do with the organization, but this is public record. Last year, LinkedIn lost 700 million data types. Now, there's a discussion like, no, this is a feature, not an issue. All right. And I'm not going to interject myself in that, but it's 700 million. So you're exactly right there. Like, we're talking about large volumes of data via the API. And is it a feature or is it a data breach? Yeah. I won't get involved there. But the point is you're exactly right. Whether it's Clubhouse, a social network or something else, APIs is the world. And if you're on the cloud, your developers have already bought into it, right? They're already using Lambda. They're already using cloud functions. So now it's like, okay, are these authorization models what we expect to see? And the amount of data mirrors or exceed what we used to do in the old days with SQL injection.
Yeah, and to me, this is what I've always called abuse cases, where it's part of your threat modeling process where you think through, okay, how are people going to mess with this, in a negative way or a malicious way? I think the very first like cloud app version or example that I can remember is the Domino's Pizza app, where somebody, the app would let them order 700 pizzas and send them to someone as a prank.
Yeah, right. And you're exactly right. Like, okay, so if I'm writing the app, why would someone do that? And we know as security people, like, because we can't, right? So essentially, what happened is, you have authentic, and what you brought up as a good point is that so there's authentication and authorization. Now, all the negative stuff I've said about authorization, it's hard and it's real with all these examples. Authentication is not so bad, honestly. Like we can solve authentication right now. So now it's like, okay, this user was authenticated. Yes, right? You have to log in, you have to create an account, you got to put your information in. But did you check that I can essentially manipulate the architecture of the API to get it to do something out of my boundary, out of my user A profile? And that's the harder part. And that's where it's not just authentication, it's authorization. And both of those have to work together when it comes to your API attack surface.
And I guess there's two sides of that. Can somebody abuse it using it as intended? And then can somebody abuse it, which is more of a, something you have to fuzz for, right? Can somebody abuse it in a way that it's not intended to be used or give up data?
Yeah. And that's the other thing. This goes a little bit beyond our world in a good way. Just don't want to talk about ourselves. But when you talk about use it, like there's a lot of places criminals need to stash data, right? And so it's like, okay, this API, the authors and model is broken. I don't really care about using the API or abusing the API, but I want to basically post data to this API so another illegal, community can get data from it, and it's not tracked back to me or my underground, well-financed operation. And so that's what we're telling customers. This is simple, right? Sounds boring, but post, right? Post commands, right? So, okay, your post command that has a authentication or authorization model. Well, what's the worst thing that can happen? This API doesn't do anything. Well, if I can post data and I can store data on your cloud via your not locked down API, then I can start, having illegal content that I want to distribute to communities with your cloud that goes into this, wide world of Amazon, Azure, or GCP that no one can really track down versus my own community. So logic abuses are still there. That's one thing that's not changed with API, whether it's web app or API. Those logic abuses are definitely still there.
And that's a good point too, because there's an aspect here of with REST APIs, modern APIs, I think that we actually have a little bit easier enumeration of them just because of the frameworks, the way that they're being developed. But even with Lambdas, any of the cloud service providers, functions as a service, they're largely stateless. Some APIs themselves are stateless, but other APIs, you actually have to set up a state to go from A to B to C to complete some workflow to find that particular abuse case that you and Adrian have been talking about. And doing that type of building state with APIs, I think, has been a little bit more of a challenge for security testing, or just maybe even testing in general. Is that something that you've seen changed over the years, or have you seen better solutions for being able to do that quality security testing of these APIs?
Yeah, and that's a great point. Where when you were testing web apps back in 2004. You didn't really have a lot of solutions for automation, and there was Selenium out there. Wasn't that great, but it's great. It's much better now. And the whole web app security platform in terms of dynamic testing is really strong. The good news on API, and again, we have nothing to do with this company, but a lot of developers for their own purposes are using Postman or Swagger specs or Open API specs. But right now, Postman is dominant at this particular point. So I would advocate to some AppSec teams out there, follow that crowd, which is like, okay, your developers are already documenting their APIs well within Postman recordings. Take that for your automation of your security testing program, right? And that is something, if you've been in AppSec for more than 3 years, that's so valuable that the developers are already using this. Yes. Let's leverage what they're using, sprinkle security testing on top of that. And hey, through the CI pipeline, we can get our security testing within their existing Postman recordings so everyone's happy at the same time.
So that's interesting because that's kind of a change in the sense that there is security coming out of engineering tools or tools that are geared
Yes.
towards developers. I think that's very different from the older AppSec industry, which was maybe insular in the sense of here's the AppSec tool. Let your developers do something, then AppSec team runs this tool that does its magic and opens vulns if it's lucky enough to work and find vulns. Or maybe you're trying to quote unquote shift left to get the developer team to use this independent tool. But you've described, I think, a much better integration that says developers are innovating, developers are doing some of these basic needs. Why don't we put the application security on top of that, make it work better?
Yeah. The good news is, as a security industry, not only do we have a seat at the table, we have a lot of power, right? That's very good. Now, I think with all power, we need to be careful that we don't lose it and we respect that power. So the good thing is everyone has to listen to us. Now, the bad thing is a lot of vendors.
Well, they don't have to.
Sorry?
They don't have to.
Well, they don't have to, but it now, like the CSO, he or she is pretty high up that if things don't go well because someone didn't listen to security, things will change pretty quickly. So back in the late 90s, literally, Mike probably has these stories. I remember my first SQL injection. I was almost laughed out of the room. People were like, "This is not a real thing. You're kind of this is such a joke. Tell us your network security issues." They're like, "No. It's all about SQL injection." And again, this is like 1999. But the good thing is we have a captive audience. But the key thing that I would say is essentially making sure that we build tools, that's us as Data Theorem, or processes, that's our counterparts, AppSec leads, for developers. Now that sounds easy, but we really have to say, like, listen, if we're going to win in security, developers have to be able to understand what we write. All the vendors who are writing products for other AppSec team people to use, that's a mistake. Does it sell? Yes, it actually sells. Those demos are beautiful, but does it actually work? Is it a workflow and onboarding and a process? No. So we have an industry have to build products for developers and understand if it's not used by them, it's basically eye candy for AppSec people. And so every week I get a report to make sure there's more developers logging onto our platform than security people. And that's been like that for 6 years. But my point is, if we write the best product for AppSec people to use, good luck getting any progress done. There's 10 AppSec people and 100 developers. Like, come on. So we got to write processes and tools, whether it's Postman or whatever CI system they have, that they understand. And honestly, they will leverage it. Maybe because they have to, because of the power hierarchy, or it's just so easy. But I think the problem is vendors, and again, we are one, so I'll take a cheap shot at ourselves. Our community has been writing products for AppSec people, which is great, but we need to automate, and the people who automate are DevSecOps, our SRE teams. And so I think a lot of companies like Data Theorem and many others have been shifting left because we know that's where we're going to make we're going to solve problems. We're going to come to the CSO's office and tell him or her, we fixed 7 issues that could have led to AppSec data breaches. And that's my cheesy dream to do every year for our given customers.
Cheesy tomato dreams. I think that's going to have to be our title for this segment. But you're also making me smile. Aside from making me hungry now too, you're also making me smile because a lot of the underlying theme of what you've been describing is strategic thinking from AppSec that we need from AppSec. Looking at, here's our layer 7. This is our new security boundaries. We need to find all the boundaries, that inventory, do that authentication, authorization, and you've been de-emphasizing the idea of this vuln, this other type of vuln. This is how we find this. Not to say they're unimportant. You mentioned SSRF is a really good example, but I like to call that, that anti-pattern of bug ops. No one really talks about we form teams or we're really trying to focus on this one particular vulnerability. We're targeting attack classes or types of attacks. As you were just saying here, if we can bring this communication to the CISO because we have a tool that helps solve a problem that the developers have or gives us better visibility into the shadow APIs so we don't get surprised about vulnerabilities, that sounds like a really, really great direction to be moving towards. So I guess maybe that's a statement. Let me throw a question in there for you. What are some easier ways or what are some maybe smart ways to try to change that thinking to really say, we do have a layer 7 problem in the cloud or just in our apps in general, and we want to tackle that?
Yeah, I love that, Mike. That's a great quote. Layer 7 problem in the cloud. That's really what it is. The cloud, modern day cloud, is not VMs. It's all app native centric. And again, Amazon, GCP, and Azure are going to force that because they don't want you moving your containers from one aspect to the other. So that's why it's not a coincidence serverless is so easy, right? Because it's sticky as well. And so I think what the good news is that there are tools right now on the cloud that you can use to inventory and lock things down. The problem is when you have a multi-cloud environment, right? So it goes back to blocking and tackling. Like I have a security policy. Every API should be authenticated. Okay, got it. And it can't be using basic auth. It should be using OAuth tokens. Okay, good, no problem. And it should be inventoried. Got it, boss. We're all good. All right, but it has to be within all my APIs, not just AWS. Like, ooh, okay, that's difficult, right? And that's why AppSec, we still have jobs, because inventory and securing and locking things down across a multi-cloud environment and even some on-prem, some legacy stuff is challenging. And I'm not gonna lie, it is challenging. Now it is doable, but that's where you need like a horizontal look at everything, not just an individual look at every given API, right? So you have an API, it serves your mobile apps, serves your web apps, maybe in a B2B partner, right? But is that only sitting on one cloud provider? Yes. Okay, we're all good. 3 different clients, 1 cloud provider. But we have another API from acquisition, and we have another API that was shadow. We didn't even know this team was using it. So that horizontal look at your policy is what I would advocate to security teams. And you're definitely right, strategic, right? So, I want to kind of emphasize something you said. Strategic is very important to me because from when I was younger, doing immature stuff, to at stake, to ISEC partners, to now Data Theorem, we know bugs are going to be around. We know people love talking about the car chase, but it's just never going to stop. So if we keep on pushing out, it's like the soda companies. If you keep on pushing out sugar, to Americans, they will drink it. But we got to take a step back saying, listen, it's not good for us to always drink sugar. Let's get more strategic and saying, listen, we can win a demo with some awesome Log4j exploit, but I'm telling you, there's going to be another one in 3 months and another one after that in 3 months. So what do you do to figure out you're not chasing the next bug, but the process works as designed. And that's what I would say being more strategic. And the strategic problem is horizontally implementing your policies across on-prem and multi-cloud. Not impossible, but that's where we don't see people starting. Like you got to start with that, because whether it's SSRF with Paige Thompson or the next Bola attack on Clubhouse, these attacks were always happening. What we don't want customers to do is saying, listen, use us because we'll find these bugs. You're going to get burnt out in 18 months. What we want to do is saying, hey, we'll inventory these and we'll apply your policy. So when these bugs come up, hopefully no data loss will be out there. And it's boring, it's snooze town, but some of the blocking and tackling with API security still need to be done.
Still needs to be done. I know. And you were telling us a great list of things that we need to start with, that organizations should start with. Unfortunately, we might have to stop with that message, but I think that's a good message to stop on since we're coming to the end of time here. Is there something that a particular resource or something you want to highlight for people to learn more about or look to in the future that perhaps you're working on?
Yeah, well, there's a few. We are coming out with essentially a free training process to essentially go way deeper in everything I talked about today. It's basically starting an API security program. I know it sounds boring. It's not a bunch of car chases, but every organization, whether you're in the cloud 100% or migrating to the cloud, an API security program, a modern one, needs to happen. And we're not selling it. There's not like a $3,000 head charge. It's free, because what we're seeing out there is the same problems that you and I, Mike, we found in the 90s. I want everyone to come with that information for free. So check us out. It's a free workshop to how to start an API security program, and getting and making sure these basic attacks are just not possible. The sophisticated attacks, that's the industry, that's our beast. We have to deal with it. But I don't want data breach happening with just a basic attack. I want our security industry to get better. So that would be the first resource I would point everyone to.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Himanshu. Thank you for joining us.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Also want to say thank you to Adrian as well, and thanks to everybody in Discord and everyone who's listening right now. We're going to take a quick break and then return with news of the week.